Why is UK productivity low, lagging behind even close countries in Europe, and what to do about it? Well, productivity is a function of technology, and that's where the UK directly doesn't have a problem because there's lots of inventions, plenty of patent registrations, but that just makes it even more puzzling. So why is productivity low? Well, you need to implement the technologies essentially in daily lives, and for companies that means they need to implement the new technology. So why is this not happening? Well, the actual measurement of productivity is the value added produced, and we have measures such as GDP, and we're really comparing this to the number of people and the hours in particular they're actually working. So people out of work are not part of the calculation. So those who work, how much value added are they producing, the GDP? Okay, so where do people actually work? Well, the majority of people work for small firms, small and medium-sized enterprises, as you abbreviated SMEs. They account for almost all companies in the UK, more than 90%, and they account for 2/3 of total employment. So really, we have to look at small and medium-sized enterprises and try to understand what's holding them back and therefore bringing down overall productivity. Now, when a small firm realizes, okay, there's a new technology in our area, we need it to upgrade, the next question is money. How can we pay for this? In the UK, there's 5 large banks dominating banking, accounting for close to 90% of deposits. And there's a problem with the size, you see. They're so big, they're global giants. There's a rule in banking, big banks want to do big deals with big customers. Small firms, not really attractive. If you can lend to large private equity funds, hedge funds, as a banker, spend your time with a hedge fund, private equity fund that can cut a check or wants to borrow from you, and you can cut the check for £1 billion apiece, £1 billion deals, or small firms that want £20,000, £50,000. There'd be millions of deals needed to make up for the sort of volume you get from dealing with the big speculative funds. Quickly, look at another country. Why is productivity so high in Germany, relatively speaking, and certainly higher historically than in the UK? Well, look at the same pieces of information. What's the small firm sector doing there? The small firms are quite fast in adopting new technology, and essentially all they need to do is when they realize, okay, in our area there's a new technology that if we don't get it, we'll start to fall behind, lose market share. They go to their local bank, they explain it, they present their business plan. The bank already knows the company, has been dealing with them, has been lending to them, and within 48 hours, if things go well, they have the money already and they can implement technology. These small banks, you see, they have one rule. They only lend locally. And as a result, they're in the same boat as their customers. The big banks in any country, if they're big, they will pick and choose. Oh, this is a prosperous area. Let's have more branches there. Oh, that area? Well, better close those branches. And the result is well known. So back to Germany. So productivity is very high, and the small firms are doing well. In fact, they're doing extremely well, to the extent that that's almost a puzzle to some researchers. If you look at this definition of hidden champions are small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, but they have top global market share in their market niche. And you can do this research for any country, but if you do a comparison, Germany has come out in the past decades top, head and shoulder above everyone else in the number of these hidden champions, small firms that have, like the Olympics, gold, silver, bronze, number 1, 2, or 3 market share in the world. Why is that? It's because Germany has the largest number of small local banks. If you look at the total number of banks of every country in Europe, which one sticks out? You don't even need to see the label. It is Germany, because most German banks. 80% of German banks are small local banks that will only lend locally. Community banks, cooperative banks, savings banks. And that's, of course, why productivity has been very high in Germany. Sadly, they have opponents, usually regulators, talk to the big banks. Governments listen to the big banks, and they've been whispering into their ear that, these small banks are a problem. We need to reduce the number. So it's actually official ECB policy to reduce the number of banks, and they've succeeded by killing 6,000 banks in Europe. Good thing, Britain doesn't have to follow this, and so can take different policies. But we have to actually take those different policies, otherwise might as well rejoin again. Now, big banks don't lend to small firms. Who lends to small firms? It is small banks. Some more examples of how this works well is the US. 4,000 banks, close to 5,000 banks, and the majority small local banks, and they've got a lighter regulatory regime, and they've been thriving, and this is quite well known. That's why the US economy has been quite resilient. Now China, that's the real clincher, because you see an economy that started out as a Soviet-style centrally planned economy, a central planner's dream. And the central bankers probably loved it because there's only one bank in town, it's them. But as we know, the Soviet system didn't really work that well, and productivity was not that great. Deng Xiaoping came to power in 1978 as a new leader, and he immediately thought he wanted to increase economic performance. And he wanted to work scientifically, look at the evidence, look at the facts. He traveled to Japan. He asked the Japanese, how do you produce 15% growth? That's an economic miracle. He found out the secret is you have many banks and make sure the majority are small local banks lending only locally. And that's what he did. So he returned to China and created thousands of banks, local banks, small banks, village banks, savings banks, regional banks, provincial banks, the whole lot, cooperative banks. 5,000 banks now in China. And of course, if we've got 5,000 banks, each has 50 branches with 20 loan officers each, you've got 5 million loan officers who now check who's getting money, how much, and for what. Whereas if you compare to the Soviet-style system that preceded this, with one central bank and maybe 5 people making the decision, I mean, which one is going to be more effective? 5 people versus 5 million going across this huge country in all the local different regions and making a decision based on the local evidence. So China, of course, did spectacularly well, producing 15% growth over 40 years, lifting more people out of poverty than anywhere before in history. So there's a simple relationship. The more banks you have, the better your economy tends to do, particularly if you have a high percentage of local banks that lend locally. Then you will get job creation, economic growth, tax revenues, government should be happy, and general prosperity, and also less inequality, a more egalitarian outcome, actually. Why is that? Well, economic growth means we've got more transactions this year than last year, but that means more money is being used for transactions this year than last year. And that means in our system, if you want to increase the money that's actually used for transactions, well, you need to increase the money supply. So next question, who creates the money? Now, I've done some surveys, and I think it will be the same result here if we had more time. The majority of the population believes that most of the money is created by the government or the central bank. But actually, the governments don't create money anymore, and central banks only create a small fraction of the money supply, 3%. 5%, that's usually it. So who creates the majority, 95, 97% of the money supply? That's been a bit of a puzzle in economics because the textbooks have been saying, well, banks are just financial intermediaries that gather existing money, as deposits, do their analysis, and then lend out. But that's actually factually wrong. And I did empirical tests, and I could establish that banks are special. They do have a license to create new money. So when you get a bank loan, the bank will newly create the money and add it to the money supply. And so in this first empirical test of all the different theories of banking, that's the one that survived, the credit creation theory. That's what the process is called. So banks are extremely special and are really the crucial catalyst in the economy. And of course, the bank has also this decision-making power. It's not just existing money that's newly channeled somewhere. No, it's the creation of new money. And whenever you create new money, it will have economic consequences. So that's why banks are so important. They are actually the ones that create the money supply. And just think back of the Chinese case before under the Soviet system, 5 central bankers allocating the whole money supply versus 5 million loan officers on the ground talking to the small firms, checking their loan applications and making a decision where the money is most productively used and sensibly used. So this decision-making power is actually being delegated to the banking system. That's why it's so important to have the right type of banking system. Do you want one that consists of 5 mega banks that don't care about small firms and lend mostly to private equity funds and hedge funds for financial speculation? Or do you want one where you've got mostly small local banks, like in Germany, community banks, that lend to the local small firms, make sure they always have enough supply of money? Well, as I ask you this question, there's some more information to make a decision, what system you might prefer. There's actually macroeconomically massive consequences. There's 3 possibilities of what can happen when banks lend for different uses of money. The one that's most dominant in the UK and other similar economies is when banks lend for somebody to purchase assets, property, real estate, houses, apartments, flats, or indeed financial assets. What happens is because the loan is money creation, you're creating new money, adding to the money supply and pumping it into that particular market. So what's going to happen when the banks increase property lending? And they usually move in lockstep, usually encouraged by the regulator or the central bank. And so when they increase property lending suddenly, there's new money creation injected into the property market, property prices go up. In fact, this in many countries has been done to a certain extent that you get asset inflation, a property bubble. And this can go on for a long time. It will stop the moment banks stop lending for property speculation, because that's what's been fueling it, the new money creation. And at that moment, property prices won't rise anymore. But the late-coming speculators, they need further rises. They go bankrupt. You start to get non-performing loans. The banks start to get more risk-averse. They reduce lending even further. You move into the opposite direction, a downward spiral of contracting credit, collapsing property values, and, of course, a banking crisis, because bank equity is small, 10% usually or less, even for big banks. Smaller banks are usually better capitalized. And if asset prices have been pushed up by 200-300% and they drop only 15% from the peak, you have a bust banking system as a result. And that's why we've had the recurring banking crises. You could, of course, get out of this very quickly if you take the right central bank policies. I proposed in 1995 in Japan to introduce a new policy which I called quantitative easing. If done correctly, sadly, that's where we have seen a lot of problems, not correctly implemented. But if you do it correctly, you don't actually have to have a banking crisis, and also no burden on the taxpayer. But anyway, this is the first of 3 scenarios. If banks create credit for consumption, because it's money creation, now consumers have more purchasing power, they demand more for consumer spending. What's going to happen to consumer prices? They go up. That's what happened from March 2020. The central banks adopted a policy through which you can force banks to create more money. The second version of my quantitative easing that I proposed in Japan, I proposed this for a deflationary situation with the economy contracting, but they implemented it for a situation where we had supply constraints and there was already expanding bank credit. So totally wrong, and therefore it had to result in inflation 18 months later. I warned about that. That's exactly what we had. That's why we have this inflation. It was the wrong use of bank credit, in this case by the central bank forcing it. But we have a third scenario, and that's the redeeming feature of banking. If banks create credit by lending to small firms for productive business investment, to implement new technologies, new ideas, increasing productivity, adding value, then you get economic growth, job creation, prosperity, and all without inflation and without crises. You get high, stable, sustainable growth. That's what you need to do. And that's, of course, what China achieved for 4 decades, Japan for 2 decades. As long as you make sure bank credit goes to small firms. And really the only way to do that is to make sure you've got many small banks. Central banks have done the opposite in recent decades. They've forced bigger banks to swallow small banks. They concentrate the banking system because, bureaucracies want more power. Concentrated system is nice for the central planners, but not for the rest of us. Because bank lending to small firms for productive business investment actually has declined in many countries, and that's, of course, also the biggest problem for the UK. So, it's time to do just what China did after 1978. Who's the Deng Xiaoping of the UK? We need to create, let's say, hundreds of small local banks. So I'm proposing as government policy, the government help establish 30 new commercial banks across the country that are local banks, only lend in their local area to small firms. 50% of the ownership should be with a local charity, and that's the model I've also proposed for Hampshire. So help me, support me in building up the Hampshire Business Bank. Get in touch, professorwerner.org, for instance. Adopt a simplified regulatory regime. That's my academic side with all my academic publications. Adopt a simplified regulatory regime for small banks below a balance sheet of 1.5 billion, say, and then they should have much simpler regulation. Small banks at the moment in Europe and the UK have to meet the same high standards as the United States demanding of the big banks only. In America, the small banks don't have to meet those, but in Europe, they're saying, no, the smallest banks with 10 employees, 20 employees, they have to have the same systems, compliance like Barclays Bank, Deutsche Bank. Doesn't make sense, does it? And thirdly, simplify the regime for bank authorization by switching to a process of registration. There's a list of things that you need to have that should be objectively easily verifiable. And then if you've got that and evidence, you automatically get your license. And that should be objectively assessed. So there can't be fussing about who gets a banking license and who doesn't. There was a time when you could register a new bank by going to the post office and get your registration. So obviously, probably you need a bit more money than in the past, but it can be done. And that's the way to have another economic miracle. We can do it. The UK has all the ingredients, and as we started out saying, the technology, the patents, the know-how is there. But the implementation is missing. The missing piece is small local banks. Thank you very much.